Imagine waking up to find yourself accused of murder with no memory of the crime. In 1987, 23-year-old Kenneth Parks drove 14 miles across Toronto, entered his in-laws' home, and brutally attacked them. He killed his mother-in-law, and he nearly killed his father-in-law. The twist? He was sleepwalking the entire time. What followed was one of Canada's most shocking and controversial cases, forcing the courts to decide, can you commit murder in your sleep? Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Brush with Death. I am your host, Miss Casey Hanalei, and in this series I sit down, I tell you a true crime story, and I create an art project at the same time, and usually it has something to do with the case. So if you love listening to true crime and you love art, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll never miss one of my terrible, but hopefully inspirational stories at the end. And also like and comment, please, because it really helps me out. So this case comes from our very first Suggest a Case to Casey. So thank you to our very own Freddie, my very own Freddie, for submitting the first case. This is the case of Kenneth Parks, and it's a very, very interesting case, especially like psychologically speaking, because he apparently killed his mother-in-law in his sleep. So let's get into this case, and if you would like to suggest your own case to Casey, I will put a link in the description below. That way you can give me all the dirty details, and maybe you will get a shout out on my channel. But thank you, Freddie, for being our first one and suggesting a case to me. Love you. All right, let's get into this. So just a little disclaimer, there isn't a ton on this story, but I found it so intriguing. Just wanted to learn more. So there is gaps in information, and what I could verify, I will tell you right now, but not a ton is known about this case, and he was acquitted, so a lot is kept private to protect him as well. So anyways, so 1986 to spring of 1987, this is where Kenneth develops a very serious gambling problem, and he has a ton of debt mounting in his name. To cover losses, he misappropriates funds from his employer and drains a lot of his family's savings. And this is consistent with a lot of the summary reports of the cases of this case that I found. So this is pretty well versed in those case files. So the night of the incident, so May 23rd, 1987, this is when Kenneth Parks spends the evening at home in Pickering, Ontario. So our Canada neighbors to the north. Hello, Canada. Oh, Canada. You guys probably hate me. Well, you hate pretty much all of America. Everyone hates America right now, so that's okay. That's fine. So he was home with his wife watching late night TV. And him and his wife had planned to see her parents the next day to admit the gambling problem and financial trouble that they were experiencing. So already I'm thinking lots of stress going on in his life. And I will tell you in a little bit, I am a sleepwalker as well. So stress has a lot to do with it, which was my first indicator of this case, which was interesting. So early morning, Sunday, May 24th of 1987, while he was asleep, Kenneth Parks drove roughly 20 kilometers, which was 14 to 15 miles from Pickering to his in-laws' home in Scarborough, using a house key that they had given him. Isn't Scarborough the name of the town in Scream? I didn't actually look it up. I feel like that sounds familiar. Anyways, inside the home, he attacks his in-laws. His mother-in-law, Barbara Woods, who was only 42 at the time, She is beaten with a tire iron or an iron bar and stabbed, and she dies of her injuries. His father-in-law, Dennis Woods, is choked and stabbed, but he actually survives. Bleeding and disoriented, Parks then drives to nearby a police station, and tells officers some version of, "I think I've just killed 2 people," and he turns himself in. Wow. So a lot to unpack there. And I'll get into it in a little bit, but like, if he was awake and he did understand what he was doing, like, there's no motivation here as far as like why he did this. So just something I wanted to point out before we get into the rest of this. So 1987, 1988, this is when the pre-trial and trial happened. So Kenneth is charged with second-degree murder for Barbara and attempted murder for Dennis. The defense prepares an automatism / sleepwalking defense supported by multiple medical specialists and sleep studies. So obviously I was very curious to know like what these studies involved. And again, there's not a ton of information on this case in particular, but I did look up a lot of information just on sleepwalking in general and violence during sleepwalking. Also, too, I did look up if, what his wife's reaction to this was, like if they were still married, like all of that stuff I just could not find, so I apologize. I had the same questions, and I was just very curious of what happened. Anyways, so the court evidence, expert testimony, in R versus V, Parks noted the following. Sleepwalking sufferers often don't intend their actions, no capacity or awareness of what's being done or its consequences. Adult sleepwalking violence is extremely rare. Some experts describe the risk of reoccurrence as infinitesimal and not statistically significant. So very, for people like me, very, very small, right? That's what that means. The family history of, somnambulism in Parks' case was consistent with known genetic links to sleepwalking. So I don't think it's necessarily hereditary, but I think depending on if your parents suffer or your siblings suffer from sleepwalking, sleep paralysis, all that stuff, it makes you more susceptible to those things. But I'm not sure if it's actually hereditary or not. So sleep studies and brain activity in violent sleepwalking episodes, I did some research in this as well. So the brain activity during sleepwalking. So polysomnographic and brain imaging studies reveal that sleepwalking reflects a disassociated brain state. Wakefulness and motor control areas, but sleep in regions responsible for judgment and planning, especially the frontal lobes. Very, very interesting. So a lot of your motor functions are still working. Too, like, I'd like to point out too, like, while you're sleeping, you're still breathing. You don't have to concentrate on breathing. Your body is making sure that you're still alive and all of those motor functions are still happening. So it's just very interesting that your personality and your decision-making brain goes to sleep, but the rest of your brain is still wide awake. Interesting. For instance, PET scans of sleepwalking teenagers show an increased activity in motor areas, but suppressed activity in regions tied to executive functions, which is the decision-making functions. Provoking and proximity often triggers violence. So people who are sleepwalking and don't automatically go cause violent acts, they have to be somehow provoked or triggered, right? A review of 32 documented cases showed that violent behavior during sleepwalking, confusional arousals, or sleep terrors was typically reactive, occurring when the sleeper was approached, touched, or met with minor, provoking. So in Kenneth's Kenneth's case, I think what happened was he sleptwalked and slept drove, which there's been known records of that happening as well. He drove to his in-laws' house, somewhere where he's been before, because typically when somebody does that, they go to somewhere that they've been before. It's a memory, and I'll get into my experiences in just a minute. But and then once he entered their home, that's when he was quote unquote provoked. And they probably were just like, what are you doing here? Like, who is that? Like, who's coming into my home? And it was said that he had a key for their house, so they probably thought he was an intruder and, maybe had swung on him first or something. I'm not victim blaming here, but, it's just I just find it a very interesting case. So, specifically, 40 to 90% of sleepwalking violence cases, depending on classification, followed close proximity or minor triggers. So, what's the commonality of sleepwalking versus violent sleepwalking episodes? So, just sleepwalking in general affects 6.9% of the population in their lifetime. So with me, I experienced most of my sleepwalking episodes when I was a young adult into adolescence, young adulthood. Now, I don't really sleepwalk that often, but I do in times of extreme stress. I will find myself having sleepwalking episodes, which is very interesting. So 6.9% of the population experience sleepwalking sometime within their lifetime. I don't know, I think it depends on the person and that kind of stuff of when they actually experience it. The frequency of violent behaviors during sleep on a large scale found that it was less than 1.6% of that 6.9% experience actual violent episodes. So a very, very small fraction of people who actually experience sleepwalking have experience of violent sleepwalking. So all that to being said, this is very, very, very rare. And two, this is kind of a landmark case for any case that involves, any question of sleepwalking and violence, right? In controlled clinic findings, so in 1995, a study of 64 patients at a sleep clinic, over 50% exhibited harmful behavior. Interesting. And another reported 70% of 41 sleepwalking patients showed potential injurious actions, though these samples came from, a clinical study and not the general population too. So all of these 64 patients all experienced sleepwalking, and 50% of them, exhibited harmful behavior. That's a lot of people, which, we're getting some conflicting information here, right? But I think clinical studies versus self-reporting, I think a lot of it isn't being reported, or maybe the person doesn't even know that they are exhibiting harmful behaviors because they're freaking asleep, So why does violence occur in some sleepwalkers? So there's this thing called the biopsychosocial risk model, and a review proposes that violence during sleepwalking is very rare, but when it occurs, it's linked to a combination of risk factors. Biological, which is a genetic predisposition to disrupted inhibitory control due to sleep deprivation or arousal abnormalities. So you are somehow biologically predispositioned to experience sleepwalking. And then also the other factor is psychological. Impulsivity, emotional stress, prior violent behaviors during wakefulness, and then there's also the social aspect to it. Substance use, poor coping skills, stressors like family conflict or gambling, which is present in Kenneth's case here. So all of these factors has something to do with the violent tendencies in some sleepwalkers, which I also found very, very interesting. So there's also this thing called reactive versus intentional violence, right? So violent acts during sleepwalking are usually reactive, not premeditated, the result of misperception or perceived threat rather than conscious aggression during sleepwalking. Some forensic psychiatric studies note most violent episodes in adult sleepwalking are impulsive and inappropriate, often provoked by attempts to awaken or restrain them. That's why they say never wake a sleepwalker, because they could turn on you. It is very scary sleepwalking. If you've ever experienced sleepwalking, I'm here to tell you it is terrifying, especially if you wake up in the middle of it, and I will tell you again my case in just a minute. But anyways, another thing I wanted to talk about was the common features of violent sleepwalking cases. So what are the common factors with all of these cases, reported cases? So usually it's predominantly male adults, ages 27 through 48. And there's usually a strong childhood or family history of sleepwalking, bedwetting, or sleep talking. And the episodes typically occur within 1.5 to 2 hours of sleep onset. So they are in a very, very deep REM sleep at this time. So just some statistics for you. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, so if you've ever experienced sleepwalking like I have, you will know that if you wake up during a sleepwalking episode, it can be very, very jarring and very alarming. So like I said, I used to sleepwalk when I was very little, and my family, the rest of my family, I have 2 sisters and mom and dad, and none of them reported really sleepwalking or sleep talking. So maybe I'm the weirdo. I don't know. I mean, we all know I'm weird, but that's besides the point. But I used to get out of my bed, and my sister used to sleep she had this, the basement was redone, and she had this basement bedroom downstairs. I used to walk down 2 flights of stairs, knock on her door, and just stand there and scare the crap out of her. And that's why she put a deadbolt on her door, was to keep me out of her room. Anyway, she would just say, Casey, go back to bed. And I would just, okay. And I would just walk back up the stairs, go back to bed. Anyways, so one really, really scary incident that I had when I was a teenager, I will tell you about. I was 15 or 16, and so my parents lived in this really big, beautiful log cabin. And my bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and it was like this loft bedroom. And so the ceiling was kind of slanted, and that's besides the point. And I was dreaming one night that I was terrified. I was running away from somebody that was chasing me in this really, really dark house. And I was running from room to room, and it was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. And then all of a sudden, I run into this room, and I see these 2 light blue doors. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can get out. I run over to the doors. I'm desperately trying to open the door, and I can hear the person behind me. I need to get out. And then all of a sudden, I realize that I'm sleepwalking, and they're not 2 blue doors. It is my 2 windows in my room, and the sun is coming up, and it's the very light blue light that I'm seeing coming through the windows. And so, terrified, I just lay back down in my bed, and I somehow go back to sleep. And in the morning, my mom comes in, and she's like, what happened here? There's stuff everywhere, broken. I had like a vase full of flowers, broken vase, there's stuff smashed. And I looked down at my fingers, and my fingers were all bloody, and there was scratch marks on my windows because I was trying to get out. That's how terrified I was. And I have plenty of stories about me sleepwalking, but that was the most terrifying and one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was so scary. And I actually, I mean, they talk about the harmful, violent behaviors that, and too, like in that state, I was so scared and didn't know what was going on that I would have done anything to be safe, So I can definitely understand how someone would be in this frame of mind, right? So if you have an interesting sleepwalking story, please send it to me. I'd love to maybe cover it on a short for YouTube or something. But so that's my story. So Thursday, May 26, 1988, the jury had a verdict for the murder charge of Kenneth Parks. About 9 hours after deliberation, an Ontario Supreme Court jury finds Kenneth Parks not guilty of murdering Barbara Woods, accepting that he had acted involuntarily while sleepwalking. So, being a sleepwalker myself, I truly believe that he was in a state where he didn't know what was going on, and he was probably so terrified that that's what he did. He was trying to protect himself in his own mind, and he involuntarily murdered his mother-in-law, unfortunately. So I'm glad that they came to this verdict, but if there's some way that this was actually premeditated, my question is, what's the motive? Is there a motive? Why would he do something like this if it wasn't provoked? Actually, why would he drive all the way over there and just, I don't know. I couldn't find anything. There wasn't any motive listed, a potential motive listed. So, post-verdict, 1988, the attempted murder charge. So, following the murder acquittal, the trial judge also acquitted Kenneth Parks of attempted murder. That charge is resolved in his favor. Later court records reflect the acquittal. So, thankfully, he was acquitted of that as well. So, there have been appeals that have been filed by the court. So the Ontario Court of Appeals upholds all the acquittals, thank goodness. The Crown appealed the acquittals further. So the Supreme Court of Canada hears the case on January 27th, 1992. They focused on whether sleepwalking should be treated as non-insane automatism, or, a complete acquittal, or a disease of the mind, a mental disorder of automatism. So in 1992, August 27, 1992, the Supreme Court affirms the acquittals and holds that on the facts, sleepwalking could be treated as a non-insane automatism, meaning no criminal liability, rather than a mental disorder. This makes Parks a leading Canada case on automatism. So I think I hope I'm saying that right. So they, every time some kind of like a sleepwalking case comes up, this is kind of the landmark case that they reference, to see, okay, is it actual sleepwalking? Were they criminally liable for anything that was done during sleepwalking? So it's just very, very interesting case. So sleepwalking is not uncommon, but violent behavior during sleepwalking is very rare. On a fraction of cases involve violence and even fewer cause harm. Violent episodes are usually triggered incidentally, not driven by intent or planning. In forensic contexts, expert testimony and documented sleep studies were essential in establishing that the actions, especially with Kenneth, were involuntary and not a product of deliberate intent. So that is the case of Kenneth Parks and the sleepwalking murder. In a later note in 2006, Kenneth briefly returned to public attention when he ran for a local school board trustee position. News stories recap the 1987 case and his acquittal, but I wasn't able to find anything else on the whereabouts of him, what he's doing now, what his family's doing now, how they're doing. Given the gravity of the crime and its personal ramifications, it's understandable and ethically appropriate that the family members' lives remain largely private unless they've chosen to share details publicly. So, why this case matters? There's huge legal significance. Parks is the go-to precedent in Canada on automatism and violent acts during sleepwalking, or parasomnia, clarifying when such states can negate the voluntary act required for criminal liability. So this is completely different than like the insane defense, right? This is completely, your decision-making brain is completely taken out of the picture here. This is not a mental disorder. This is actual just your brain shutting off and doing its normal function, and you just happen to be sleepwalking, be provoked, and unfortunately commit a violent crime. So just all around very interesting case. I found it very interesting and personally linked just because, first of all, Freddie recommended it and he thought it was an interesting case, and also he thought it was relevant for myself to cover because I have such a history with sleepwalking as well, which I found very enlightening and a little weirdly comforting, you know? So like always, I like to end on a quote, and this one is from John Milton, once wrote in Paradise Lost, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven or a hell of heaven." In Kenneth Parks' case, his sleeping mind turned a peaceful life into a walking, waking nightmare, without him even knowing it, which is so scary, what the mind is capable of. And I think it just kind of solidifies the fact that we need to be very careful of what we put in our minds and our brains. You know, I should talk because I talk about true crime all the time, and that's my shtick, you know. But just be very careful of what you let in. I know that with myself, I have to be very careful and take breaks from true crime. I still do this YouTube series, obviously, but I take breaks from actually consuming it myself just because I need to protect this up here and my mental health. So just be careful and be kind to yourself and make sure that you're not filling your brain with just a bunch of crap. Right? Bunch of scary crap, you know. All right, so without further ado, let's look at the piece that I did for this case. And this one is definitely different. It's not like like an inspirational piece, so to say, but I did do, and you can barely see it. It's really dark. Ooh, it's really pretty. So I did a different technique on this one. I did like kind of an opacity play on the different layers. And if you pay attention during the, when I'm actually drawing it and you can see how I'm doing it, it's a very interesting technique. So you can see she's sleepwalking. And I'd like to think that that's me, maybe. Sleepwalking, and then she gets up in a very dazed, dreamy state. I wanted to make it very murky feeling, of if you've ever had sleepwalking or even in a dream, lucid dreaming, right? It can be a very, kind of an interesting experience for your mind, so that's kind of what I wanted to replicate in this piece. All right, guys. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that case, and thank you so much to Freddie for recommending it. I really enjoyed researching it a little bit more, and I hope that you especially learned a lot from it. And all right, guys, so please like and comment and subscribe to this channel. Please submit a case to Casey with the link below and give me all the details, and I will try to shout you out. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope that I see you in the next video. Be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, and I love you. Bye, guys. Trials, forcing the courts to decide. Can you okay.